just shake his legacy, it ruptured an entire belief empire. Because if Tom Cruise was never just an actor, but the shining mask of a system built on fear, silence, and global loyalty, then what else have we blindly worshipped in the name of entertainment? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Capitol Hill, 8:57 a.m. The marble halls didn't echo with footsteps, but with tension. Inside hearing room 3A, security swept twice, then once more, before unlocking the chamber doors. Not for a president, not for a whistleblower, but for Tom Cruise, Hollywood icon, daredevil, and global face of Scientology, a movement cloaked in secrecy and power. This wasn't about a movie premiere. It was about belief used as influence, fame weaponized to shield abuse. Cameras were barred, but outside, media swarmed like it was a red carpet. This wasn't spectacle, it was reckoning. At the center sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, dressed in black, her focus sharper than any lens. As chair of the House Oversight Subcommittee, she wasn't just questioning Cruise. She was challenging the very machinery that let personalities dictate policy. Some in the room doubted her. They always did. But Jasmine knew this. When the truth threatens power, it never walks in welcomed. It kicks the door down. Cruise entered in a crisp navy suit, flanked by lawyers polished like mirrors. No applause, no nods. Jasmine stared him down, waiting for silence. Then she spoke, low and charged. Today we confront an empire with no borders, where faith is monetized, where fame shields harm, and where systems fall asleep while citizens are misled. Her words landed like steel. Cruise sat still, but his clenched jaw said what his face wouldn't. Behind him, Scientology reps sat stiff, rehearsed, but not untouchable. Not here. Scientology. To outsiders, a church. To defectors, a cage. Founded by sci-fi writer L. Ron Hubbard, it taught that humans were thetans, immortal souls burdened by ancient trauma. Auditing was the cure, via an e-meter, a tool critics called pseudoscience at best, psychological warfare at worst. Behind promises of clarity lay broken families, lawsuits, surveillance, and fear. And Cruise? He wasn't just a member. He was the movement's megaphone. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice silent now, but her gaze thundered. Your fame won't protect you. Not from this, not from me. Fear and the two. And just as the silence sharpened into a blade, the doors opened. He walked in like a man immune to consequence. Tom Cruise, perfectly tailored, posture measured, expression etched with effortless confidence. The brief roar from the hallway bled through the heavy doors. Cheers from fans, former supporters, and a few lobbyists who still worshipped him, not for what he believed, but for what he represented. A symbol, a myth. Not a man on trial, but a legend defending his legacy. That's how he wanted the moment to feel. But the rules inside this room were different. There were no agents whispering praise, no producers adjusting the lights, no cameras to capture his better angles. The applause was cut at the door. By law, the House Oversight Committee had ordered a total media blackout. No live streams, no photographs, no second takes. For once, Tom Cruise would have to stand alone, unscripted, and yet he still moved like the cameras were rolling. Every blink measured, every gesture calibrated. He nodded as if greeting old friends. When he reached the witness table, he adjusted the mic with the grace of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, he began, voice smooth, practiced, dangerously calm. Then came the line he'd rehearsed, the line his legal team had likely tested in focus groups. I'm not a politician. I don't create policy. My role in American life is cultural, not political. I uplift, I entertain. That's all. To anyone unfamiliar with the game, it sounded benign, even humble. But to Jasmine Crockett, who had spent years studying how power hides behind persona, it was an act of erasure, not explanation. He wasn't just distancing himself from Scientology's alleged abuses. He was erasing the possibility that his influence could even be questioned. And the injustice of it clawed at her, because she knew, better than most, how dangerous it was when a man like this, wrapped in the armor of admiration, got to decide where accountability began and ended. He had shaped narratives, swayed millions, stood shoulder to shoulder with those who called science a lie and therapy a weakness. Yet here he was, portraying himself as merely a bystander in the system he helped build. That wasn't humility, it was strategy, and it was working on some of the people in that room. As murmurs of approval rippled across the committee table, Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. But something shifted behind her eyes. A tension, not born of anger, but of clarity. She realized in that instant that this wasn't just a hearing, it was a performance. And the lead actor still thought he was untouchable. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She had seen this maneuver before, polished denial wrapped in the language of inspiration. She leaned in slowly, not to match his tone, but to erase its illusion. Her voice was calm, but there was weight behind it, a weight born of courtroom battles, lived experiences, and the long silence of those who'd never had a mic to answer back. Culture, she said, is never innocent when it replaces truth with spectacle. It doesn't matter how many millions clap, how many headlines sing, or how many awards are stacked on a shelf. When culture becomes armor for harm, it stops being art. It starts becoming alibi. She held the pause, not for drama, but to let the words land where they needed to. Cruz met her gaze but said nothing. Around them, a few staffers shuffled uncomfortably, unsure whether to admire her poise or fear the fire she just lit. Because this wasn't a political performance, it was a moral cross-examination, and it was working. Cruz finally leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers laced like a man preparing for takeoff. His tone remained controlled, but something in it tightened, a slight drop in warmth, a trace of defensiveness he hadn't needed before. "With respect, Congresswoman," he began, his words clipped with precision. "Scientology has done what government systems rarely can. It has helped people, millions, navigate emotional crises, addiction, trauma, in ways no federal agency has ever been able to." He paused just long enough to let that comparison sting. "I'm not here to defend politics. I'm here because belief matters. And when people are abandoned by the institutions meant to protect them, they come to us, and we show up." His voice didn't rise, but its certainty was thunderous. In his mind, he wasn't answering a question. He was winning a war. But Jasmine hadn't come for a debate. She came for disclosure. And now she opened the file that would change the tone of the room forever. With deliberate care, she drew a heavy folder from beneath her notes. Simple in appearance, but weighed down by consequence. No theatrics, no dramatic flourish, just truth sharpened into pages. She placed it gently on the desk in front of her, then slid it forward so the microphones would catch every word that followed. "This," she said evenly, "is not conjecture. It's documentation. Over 200 pages of sworn affidavits, internal communications, and sealed civil complaints from individuals once loyal to Scientology, now broken by it." She paused just long enough to let that sink in. Then with a practiced hand, she flipped open the folder. The first page bore the initials of a woman who had been 15 years old when she was assigned to forced labor under spiritual rehabilitation. The second, a transcript of an internal tribunal where a victim of sexual misconduct was advised not to report the crime, but to undergo additional auditing to confront her own threatened weakness. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of the material spoke for itself. "This religion," she continued, "has been accused, credibly, repeatedly, of breaking families apart, of isolating members from the outside world, of leveraging fear and spiritual guilt to silence those who dare speak out." She gestured calmly to the large display behind her, which flickered on, revealing emails, real, time-stamped, between senior church officials discussing disciplinary lockdowns, the monitoring of uncooperative members, and the strategic containment of media exposure. The committee members leaned in. Several aides stopped typing. Even Cruz, for the first time, shifted in his chair. And that's when Jasmine delivered the blow that didn't come with volume, but with precision. "What you call healing," she said softly, "others remember as captivity. What you defend as belief, they endured as psychological control. And what this country cannot afford is to let charisma erase accountability. And if survivor testimony had pierced the illusion, then what she pulled next would tear it wide open. Jasmine reached down without a word and lifted a new file, thicker, stamped with a seal that silenced the room more effectively than any gavel ever could. A deep blue cover, embossed with the gold insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She placed it on the desk in front of her, then took a long breath before speaking. The following contents, she said, come directly from closed-door investigations conducted over the past 16 years by multiple units of the FBI. These are not opinions. These are intelligence reports, subpoena logs, internal memos, and financial tracking documents, most of which have never been made public. Until now. She opened the file with purpose, flipping past summary pages and case indices until she reached a set of documents marked with one word in thick black font: confidential. She began to read aloud. The tone in her voice didn't change, but the gravity behind it deepened. In 2013, Bureau analysts concluded that high-ranking Scientology executives authorized the formation of shell corporations in Luxembourg, the British Virgin Islands, and Nevada, none of which were registered under the church's official name. These entities funneled charitable donations and membership fees into offshore accounts used to purchase real estate, fund litigation, and pay undisclosed leadership salaries. She looked up. These were not minor errors. These were deliberate acts of concealment designed to protect over $168 million in untaxed assets. A beat of stunned silence followed. Then she flipped to another report. In 2016, she continued, field agents investigating whistleblower allegations discovered that certain branches of the church kept no electronic records at all, operating solely on verbal communication to avoid subpoena exposure. When they anticipated a raid, physical documents were burned. Security footage was wiped. Internal messages referred to it as spiritual sanitization. She paused and set the report down beside the first. One witness, formerly part of the church's legal defense team, testified that part of her job involved learning how to evade discovery without committing provable perjury. No one interrupted. Not one cough. Not one shift in a chair. What she had laid out was no longer a question of belief. It was a pattern of evasion so calculated it could only be described as institutional. And as the final image appeared on the monitor behind her, a network diagram tracing the flow of money across 3 continents, all converging at a handful of names. Jasmine didn't blink, her voice steady and low, carved through the silence like steel drawn in a cathedral. You've told this country your church saves souls, but the evidence shows it's been saving money, quietly, illegally, and with absolute confidence that no one would dare pull back the curtain. But if the documents rattled the foundation, then the next words Jasmine spoke struck at the very heart of it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her strength now came from stillness, the kind that made people lean in before they even realized they were holding their breath. We've heard the numbers. We've seen the charts. But it's in the loved words of those who escaped that this machine finally reveals its architect, she said. She reached into a second compartment of her folder and removed a slim transcript, a single sheet yet dense with weight. This is sworn testimony, taken under oath, from a former Sea Organization lieutenant with 3 decades of internal access to the church's compliance operations. She laid the sheet on the desk without drama and then spoke slowly, every syllable deliberate. He describes a structure built not just on doctrine, but on silence, on fear, and on control. And at the center of that structure, above all public ranks and ceremonial titles, stood a civilian name. Repeatedly referenced in internal memos, event briefings, and private leadership huddles. That name, she said, lifting her eyes now to Cruz, was yours. She allowed the weight of that moment to fill the space before continuing. The witness describes you not merely as a donor or ambassador, but as the patron saint of control. A title bestowed not by fans or marketing teams, but by internal enforcers within the church. She turned toward the committee members, some of whom had now shifted from skepticism to focus. This individual states that you were granted access to behavioral audit files, given verbal summaries of disciplinary cases, and routinely consulted on high-level image management decisions, particularly in situations where criminal liability was being weighed against public relations optics. Behind her, the screen changed. One quote filled it: simple, damning, and unembellished. He wasn't just protected by the system, he protected the system. She let the words hang, untouched, like smoke that no one dared wave away. Tom Cruise remained still. His face was composed, sculpted into the same performance-hardened calm he'd worn through 1,000 interviews, 1,000 press junkets. But something, just beneath the surface, had shifted. It was in the way he blinked half a beat too late, in the way his fingers tightened against the table. Not in anger, but in calculation. As if his mind, for the first time in years, had run out of scripted exits. And Jasmine saw it. She didn't press harder. She didn't need to. The silence in the room had already chosen sides, and all she had done was speak what everyone else had feared to say. And when the silence finally fractured, it wasn't with regret, it was with resistance. Tom Cruise leaned forward, elbows braced against the polished wood, his fingers interlaced like he was holding something back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Decades of global adoration had taught him that control was quieter than anger. "Who are you?" he said, the words low but cutting. "To sit there and question me?" He paused, letting the echo of his own voice fill the space. "I've spent my life building something that gave people hope. I've stood in front of nations after disasters. I've opened clinics, raised money, lifted people out of despair when no government even picked up the phone." He gestured barely. "I've given everything to this country, not with a title, but with action. And now I'm here, being dissected by someone who's never done half of what I've done." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that what this country's come to? Putting its servants on trial while its cynics take the mic?" There was no rebuttal from Jasmine. Not right away. She let the silence sit, thick and unmoving like fog before a storm. And then, with the steadiness of someone who had heard those words too many times in too many forms, she spoke. "I didn't come here to inspire," she said, her voice neither cold nor warm, only real. "That's your job. Mine is different. I was sent here to draw lines between truth and illusion, to make sure power doesn't get to rewrite the rules just because it knows how to smile through scandal." She folded her hands. "You talk about service, but service isn't measured by applause. It's measured by whether you let accountability through the same door that fame opened for you." Her eyes didn't leave his. "And you're right. This country has changed. It's just finally learning how to ask the questions it once let people like you avoid." The room didn't erupt. It froze. Outside, the reaction began to fracture like glass under pressure. Networks spun their angles. Commentators picked sides. Some called her disrespectful. Others said she was the only person in the room who remembered what duty looked like. Photos of Cruise leaving the chamber with a clenched jaw flooded the press. But inside that wood-paneled room, Jasmine Crockett had done what no court, no journalist, no whisper campaign had been able to do for 2 decades. She confronted the man, not the myth. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that truth doesn't care how long you've held the spotlight. It only asks what you've done with it. The room had heard paper. It had heard charts. It had even heard fire disguised as testimony. But it hadn't yet heard a voice that shouldn't exist in this space. Not until now. Jasmine Crockett took a long pause. Not to gather herself, she was already prepared, but to make space for the silence. A very specific kind of silence. The kind that comes just before something unignorable. She didn't raise her hand for effect. She simply turned her head to the committee clerk seated near the screen and said calmly, "Please play Exhibit 12." The lights dimmed. A soft, mechanical click echoed as the speakers activated. The screens around the hearing room flickered, first to black, then to a time-stamped video overlay reading, "Sealed audio, divorce proceedings, June 2012. For a moment, there was only white noise. And then a voice came through, not dramatic, not angry, just tired, careful, controlled. "I was told I couldn't object." The sound was unmistakably Katie Holmes. Her voice, fragile in its steadiness, carried none of the polish of red carpets or rehearsed interviews. This was a woman speaking not to an audience, but to record, to history, to protect something bigger than herself. When the education session started, it was made very clear to me that I was not to interfere. I could observe, but I was not to comment. I was not to ask who was in the room. I was not to ask why our daughter was being asked about engrams. There were no images, only the glowing timestamp and her voice cutting through the dark. I didn't even know what an engram was. I wasn't raised that way. I wasn't raised in that system. But they said it didn't matter. That saying no meant I wasn't spiritually aligned. That if I resisted, it would prove I was unfit to guide her. A few people in the hearing room shifted in their chairs, not from boredom, from something colder, heavier, because what they were hearing wasn't an allegation. It was a slow, quiet unraveling of something that had long been hidden under NDAs, public smiles, and custody agreements no one was allowed to read. She was 5 years old. They wanted her to start processing memories from past lives. They said it was important to start early. They told me she'd been a warrior once, that she needed to be cleared so she could fulfill her role in this one. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink. Her hands remained folded in front of her as the audio played on, and Tom Cruise, seated directly across from her, tightened his jaw ever so slightly. And when I asked for space, for time, they said I was projecting negative energy, that I was obstructing spiritual progress. I was her mother. But in that house, for those few months, I stopped feeling like a parent. I felt like a liability. The voice paused, not for dramatic effect, but because the speaker had to. There was one day I found her in a room with 3 adults I didn't know. She was sitting silently. One of them had an e-meter. I asked who they were. They asked me to leave the room. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't touch her, but they looked at me like I was the interruption, like I was the outsider in my own daughter's life. Then the audio stopped, abruptly, no fade, just silence. And in that silence, the entire chamber seemed to collapse inward. No one spoke. No one moved. Not even Cruz's attorneys, who moments earlier had been whispering behind their tablets, looked up. The air in the room had changed, not with volume, but with something slower, denser, an emotional gravity too sharp to escape from. Jasmine waited, exactly 6 seconds, long enough for the word to sink, short enough to keep them alive in everyone's mind. Then she looked across the room. "Mr. Cruz," she said, "would you like to respond?" His posture remained upright, perfectly still. He adjusted the cuff of his suit, then leaned forward, lips slightly parted, but no words came immediately. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, polished but pressed, the practiced cadence of a man used to controlling a narrative, but now painfully aware it was slipping. "That was taken out of context," he said, his voice careful. "That was an emotionally charged time, a custody negotiation. Things get said in those environments that don't always reflect reality." His words hung like a sheet caught in wind, visible but thin. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't even respond. She just watched him, the way his eyes flicked not toward her, but toward the committee, then the press box, then to the edge of the desk, looking for something, anything. That would hold, but there was nothing to hold, because Katie Holmes hadn't raised her voice in that recording. She hadn't accused him of abuse. She hadn't named names. She hadn't screamed, wept, or demanded justice. She had simply spoken like someone who had already made peace with not being believed, and recorded it anyway. That was what made it unshakable. And in that moment, Tom Cruise's denial couldn't touch it, because no one in the room had heard her fight him. They'd only heard her survive him, and in hearings like this, survival speaks louder than guilt ever will. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not stunned, not respectful. It was loaded, like a storm that hadn't yet broken, but everyone could smell in the air. A staffer coughed, another scribbled notes, but no one filled the space with commentary, because Jasmine Crockett had done what no cross-examination or forensic audit ever could. She'd played the one thing the room wasn't prepared to hear: a mother, powerless in the presence of institutional control. And no amount of charm, prestige, or pre-rehearsed defense could undo that. Not in here, Not anymore. But power never yields easily. And with his myth beginning to fracture, Tom Cruise did what he'd always done best. Project Conviction. His voice didn't rise. If anything, it softened. Low, deliberate, the voice of a man who knew how to command a stadium without ever shouting. "I didn't force anyone," he said slowly, eyes scanning the room like he was drawing them back under his gravity. "That's not what I do. That's not what we do. I've never put a gun to anyone's head. I've never made a single soul stay. What I offer is belief, and people take it because they're starving for it. In a world full of broken promises and systems that fail them, I give them something to hold on to, something to live for." His words hovered like incense, warm, intoxicating, familiar. "You call it manipulation," he continued, "but I call it purpose. I call it choice." And in that moment, he wasn't just defending himself. He was defending the entire machinery of influence that had always followed him, protected him, elevated him. But Jasmine Crockett had seen what choice looked like when it came wrapped in dependency. She waited until he finished. Then she leaned forward, not with hostility, but with terrifying clarity. "You say it's a gift," she said, voice even. "But it's not a gift when it comes with conditions. It's not a gift when someone has to choose between community and compliance, between belonging and silence, between being healed and being owned." Her tone didn't waver. "You didn't need a gun. You had something more powerful. You had admiration. You had authority. You had belief. And you sold it in a form people were too afraid to question." The room didn't stir, but the weight of her words hung like a verdict. No one should be paid to deliver salvation that punishes doubt. No one should call it faith when fear is part of the contract. Cruise didn't respond, not right away, because there was nothing scripted enough to meet that kind of truth. But truth, once spoken aloud, has a way of unlocking the fear in others. And the next voice that rose in the room didn't come from Jasmine, but from across the table. Congressman Alan Worth, a former prosecutor from Illinois, known for his no-frills demeanor, adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and leaned forward over the microphone. "Mr. Cruise," he said slowly without inflection, "have you ever used your influence, your public standing, your access to media, or your role within the church to suppress allegations of abuse or misconduct, directly or indirectly?" The words landed like weight on stone. No decoration, no theatrical framing, just the blunt architecture of accountability. The room fell still again, but this stillness was different. There was a tension in it, not suspense, but expectation, as if the very oxygen had turned into a jury waiting for a simple answer. Across the room, cameras may have been banned, but every pen in the press box froze. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to. This wasn't her moment. It was his. A moment to rise, to own, to confront. And Tom Cruise knew it. He straightened his back, his lips pressed together in an almost imperceptible movement. A familiar expression, refined, intentional. One that signaled discipline, not discomfort. But behind it, something flickered. A calculation, a narrowing of variables. He held eye contact with Worth for 2 seconds too long before speaking. Not long enough to appear shaken, but just long enough for everyone watching to wonder if he was. Then came the response. "I don't respond to questions built on false premises," he said, voice low, perfectly modulated. "That's not a question. That's an accusation wearing a tie." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch, but he also didn't answer. He didn't say no. He didn't say yes. He didn't offer explanation, evidence, or contradiction. What he offered instead was distance, crafted language, self-defense disguised as offense. And for a moment, it was almost enough. The line was clever, smooth, deniable. Until you listened again and realized what was missing. Truth. Worth leaned back, said nothing more, because silence in this room had begun to mean something different. It no longer protected the powerful, it revealed them. And when Cruise refused to answer, the silence that followed didn't just stay in the room, it detonated across the country. By the time Jasmine Crockett's closing statement faded from the walls of Hearing Room 3A, the outside world had already moved. Fast, violently, relentlessly. The clip of her exchange with Cruz, just 93 seconds long, raw, unfiltered, no music, no edits, was posted by an aide before she'd even stepped out of the chamber. Within 3 minutes, it had crossed 1 million views. Within 10, 5 million. In less than 2 hours, it hit 20 million, crashing servers on 3 platforms simultaneously. It wasn't just being watched, it was being dissected, clipped, reposted, subtitled in 7 languages, shared by people who had never once agreed on anything. And for a few rare seismic hours, truth had momentum. The hashtag split the country in half like a political fault line. Cruise control surged first, posted by those defending him, insisting he was being targeted, framed, disrespected. Some argued the hearing was a stunt. Others called Jasmine a radical. A few called her worse. But then something else began to rise. Slow at first, then like a storm gathering over flat land. Let her speak. 3 words. No accusation. No venom. Just the quiet demand that someone like her, someone who didn't look or speak like the men Hollywood typically answered to, be heard without interruption, without narrative redirection, without apology. On TikTok, teens who'd only seen Cruz in Mission Impossible clips were now duetting his courtroom silence with blunt text overlays. This isn't Ethan Hunt. This is someone dodging a mother's voice. On Reddit, threads with hundreds of thousands of upvotes broke down the hearing frame by frame, where he blinked, where his fingers tensed, how many seconds he delayed before answering the question about his influence. On Twitter, a single quote from Jasmine went viral with no caption at all. No one should get paid to sell belief when obedience is the price tag. Within hours, the narrative Cruz had spent years building began to slip through the seams. But what changed everything wasn't the numbers. It was the names. Because in the hours that followed, former members of the Church of Scientology, many of them anonymous for years, began posting. Not vague statements, not cryptic allusions, declarations, real names, real faces, real pain. A woman named Bethany Rowe, who had disappeared from the public eye after leaving the Sea Org in 2014, posted a 2-minute video to Instagram, tears and rage sitting just beneath her voice. I watched that hearing, she said. I watched Jasmine Crockett say things I never thought anyone would say on record. And I want to say this now because I couldn't say it back then. He knew. Tom Cruise knew. Maybe not every detail, but he knew what happened to people like me, and he smiled for the camera anyway. The post hit 2 million views in an hour. The church released no statement. Then came Marcus Trevino, a former recruiter from the Celebrity Center in Los Angeles. In a TikTok live stream, his voice shaking, but eyes steady, he said, "We were told that anything involving Cruz needed to be pristine. No noise, no conflict. If someone said something negative near his name, we shut it down. That wasn't faith. That was fear disguised as PR." By nightfall, the story was no longer about belief. It was about control, power, and the cost of silence. Even cable news, which had tiptoed around Scientology for decades out of legal anxiety, began to crack. On MSNBC, an anchor known for her cautious tone looked directly into the camera and said, "We've been afraid to cover this. Let's be honest about that." But what Jasmine Crockett did today wasn't about religion. It was about asking what happens when truth runs into a fortress built from fame. And that fortress blinked. Meanwhile, a firestorm erupted in Hollywood. Some celebrities defended Cruz. Old friends, past co-stars, producers with multi-million-dollar stakes in upcoming releases. They posted statements of support, highlighting his work ethic, his generosity, his decades of success. But others stayed silent. A few unfollowed his accounts quietly. A few posted vague messages about believing survivors. And then a few, braver, or perhaps just done being afraid, spoke directly. An anonymous message leaked to Variety from a current A-list actor read simply, "You can't call it a church when its loyalty is bought in fear and its silence is enforced through lawyers." By the next morning, opinion polls showed something that shook Cruz's PR team to its core. A majority of Americans now believed he had actively enabled misconduct within Scientology, even if he hadn't directly participated. The myth had ruptured, Not because someone had screamed it down, but because someone had calmly, methodically, and unapologetically stood still and let the silence do its work. But for Jasmine Crockett, the backlash was personal. On one side, she was being hailed as fearless, principled, unshakable. Civil rights groups posted tributes. Law professors called her Exchange with Cruz, one of the most surgical interrogations of celebrity power in congressional history. High school debate teams analyzed her rhetorical control, but the other side came with knives. Threats filled her inbox. Memes distorted her image. Anonymous letters were slid under her office door with words like, "Watch yourself," and "You think this ends here?" She reported them, quietly, carefully, but she didn't stop. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't walked into that chamber to go viral. She hadn't confronted Tom Cruise to win applause. She had done it because truth, no matter how delayed, still deserves a witness. And now that truth had found air, it was refusing to leave. Every hour brought new stories, new names, new cracks in a structure that had held for too long under too much manufactured reverence. And every hour the same clip played again and again across the globe. Jasmine Crockett, seated across from one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, looking him in the eye and saying words that were never supposed to be heard inside that room. No one should be paid to sell a belief when obedience is the price tag. And somewhere in that repetition, something extraordinary happened. The myth didn't just fall, it was seen for what it was, for what it cost, and for the silence it demanded until the right voice finally broke through. But when the myth begins to fall, it doesn't shatter all at once. It fractures piece by piece in boardrooms, in inboxes, in whispered meetings that never appear on calendars. The first call came just before dawn. A senior executive at one of the Big Five studios rang his legal department. He didn't give an order. He didn't express concern. He simply asked a question. Do we have an exit clause tied to reputational damage? It was the kind of question that doesn't come from panic, but from strategy, from survival. Because after 24 hours of viral fallout, Tom Cruise's name wasn't just trending, it was triggering liability reviews. By noon, a second studio had frozen all promotional planning for his upcoming $200 million action release. By the end of the day, 3 separate agencies confirmed that at least 2 streaming platforms were pulling out of talks for a long-rumored franchise deal. The momentum had flipped, not against his talent, not even against his legacy, but against his insulation, against the idea that no amount of documented truth could make a brand this big bleed. Behind closed doors, damage control meetings erupted. Executives used words like optics, brand risk, legacy volatility. Some argued for patience, pointing to Cruise's global market appeal. Others said nothing, because they'd seen this moment coming for years and knew it was now unavoidable. "We can't afford to look complicit," one senior VP said flatly in a leaked internal call. "We rode the wave, but this wave is turning on itself." Actors with pending contracts began requesting moral clauses be revisited. Several quietly asked their reps not to schedule press with him, and one producer, caught by paparazzi leaving a Los Angeles restaurant, said only 2 words when pressed about whether Cruise's next film was still happening. "We're evaluating." But it wasn't just Hollywood watching. From Geneva to New York, organizations that had spent years trying to penetrate the wall around Scientology finally saw their moment and moved with precision. That afternoon, Amnesty International issued a formal statement, urging the U.S. Department of Justice to open a full-scale public inquiry into the Church of Scientology's operations, citing persistent allegations of coercive control, psychological abuse, and obstruction of justice. Human Rights Watch followed just 2 hours later with a more pointed request. "We recommend the appointment of a special federal counsel to investigate the institutional use of celebrity status as a shield against accountability." Within hours, petitions were circulating, hundreds of thousands of signatures from citizens demanding the IRS reevaluate the church's tax-exempt status. Survivors organized live streams. Legal experts began threading together the documents Jasmine Crockett had introduced in the hearing with previously suppressed testimonies. It no longer felt like political theater. It felt like the beginning of a reckoning. For years, critics of Scientology had been dismissed as fringe, bitter, or unreliable. But now they were backed by congressional record, And the woman who had delivered that record wasn't a pundit, a celebrity, or a YouTuber. She was a member of Congress with legal expertise, unimpeachable composure, and nothing to gain but the truth. Still, the opposition moved in shadows. One entertainment lawyer anonymously told Deadline that Cruz's legal team had already begun drafting letters to block further commercial damage, including threats of defamation suits against former members now speaking publicly. But even those tactics felt tired, because the truth was no longer hiding in dark corners. It was playing out in real time across millions of screens. Journalists dug deeper. Financial analysts began identifying nonprofit entities linked to Scientology that funneled millions through foreign holding companies, confirming the very financial patterns Jasmine had displayed in the hearing. One investigative team released a map of real estate owned by church affiliates in California alone, noting that dozens of properties were purchased under LLCs managed by shell organizations registered offshore. Each headline chipped away at the polished armor Cruz had worn for decades. Each revelation made the silence he offered during the hearing feel heavier, more suspicious, more damning. The entertainment world, long defined by its loyalty to profit over principle, had reached a crossroads, not because executives suddenly grew consciences, but because association now equaled risk, and risk in this industry was poison. One by one, the dominoes leaned. A prominent screenwriter tweeted that she had turned down a Cruz project 3 months earlier and now felt vindicated, not bitter. A casting director leaked that A-list actresses had begun requesting in writing that their names not appear in franchise negotiations tied to the actor. And a high-profile director, who had previously collaborated with Cruz on 3 blockbusters, released a short, blistering statement. There's a difference between playing a hero and being one. That line used to be blurry. Jasmine Crockett just made it clear. And through it all, the man at the center of the storm remained silent. Cruz's publicist declined interview requests. His legal team issued no formal statement. A spokesperson from the Church of Scientology released a 3-sentence denial, claiming coordinated defamation efforts and politically motivated attacks. But the press didn't bite. The moment had shifted. The usual methods, threat, retreat, redirection, were no longer effective. Because this wasn't just a PR problem, it was a systemic unmasking, and it had begun at the highest levels of government, on the record, with witnesses and evidence, and now, momentum. Even late-night hosts, usually cautious around legal landmines, began to weigh in. One joked, Tom Cruise spent his whole career trying to outrun consequences on screen. Turns out they run faster in real life. Laughter followed, but it didn't carry the usual sting of satire. It carried the tone of inevitability, of something finally undeniably cracking. The conversation shifted from if studios would sever ties to when and how publicly. Cruz's next scheduled appearance at a film festival was quietly canceled due to scheduling conflicts. A major global brand paused a multi-year sponsorship deal. And in the war rooms of powerful agencies and studios, decisions were no longer being made to protect a legacy. They were being made to protect the future. And Jasmine? She said nothing more that day. She didn't post a follow-up. She didn't hold a press conference. She simply walked out of the Capitol that evening under heavy security, flanked by 2 aides, phone dark in her hand. But across the digital sky, her words had already carved a path that no crisis manager could undo. When influence silences accountability, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes complicity. And that was the word now echoing in every meeting room from Burbank to DC. Complicity. Not belief, not inspiration, not even loyalty. And suddenly, for Tom Cruise, for the church, and for every institution that had quietly held the walls in place, that word was the most dangerous of them all. But when the institutions begin to tremble, the voices they once ignored become the center of the conversation. And Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman. She was the moment. 3 days after the hearing, 60 Minutes called. No filter, no spin. They wanted her. Not as a panelist, not as a commentator, but as the feature, the whole segment. A full 15 minutes of uninterrupted time in a national broadcast slot reserved for wars, whistleblowers, and the rare figures who broke through noise with something the country could no longer ignore. She didn't accept right away. She asked for the full terms. She asked for editorial transparency. She wanted to be certain she wouldn't be framed as angry, as performative, as the congresswoman who went viral. She was no stranger to how truth could be diluted by the very platforms that pretended to elevate it. When the camera rolled, Jasmine sat still. No bright colors, no soundstage glamour. A navy blue blazer, a bare desk, a simple microphone. "I didn't confront Tom Cruise," she said in the opening minute. "I confronted a system, a belief structure built on protection, of image, of control, of money, and I asked it to explain itself." It didn't. Her voice didn't rise once, but the force in her words never dipped. She spoke of Katie Holmes, of coerced silence, of tax law and financial shells, of the language of salvation weaponized against those too vulnerable to resist it. "People aren't just manipulated through violence," she said. "Sometimes they're manipulated through admiration, through awe, through the lie that someone powerful could never be dangerous." The segment aired at 7:03 p.m. Eastern. By 7:06, the internet was on fire again. But this time it wasn't just echo chambers repeating what they had already heard. It was new voices, real-time reactions, families at dinner tables watching in shocked silence. Retired FBI agents tweeted confirmation of Jasmine's timeline. Former prosecutors began calling for state-level action. Independent journalists launched threads breaking down every phrase in Cruz's evasive answers, comparing them to Scientology's own internal language manuals. The momentum, once viral, was now institutional. And somewhere behind tinted windows and guarded gates, Tom Cruise was watching too. At 8:41 p.m., his team posted a statement. It was short, clean, crafted, but beneath the polish, the edges were sharp, not defensive, but wounded. "I have spent my entire adult life trying to uplift people, to help them see beyond their pain, to inspire them to rise. I've done so publicly, passionately, and without shame. I've been a believer, a teacher, a student. And now I find myself betrayed by the very people I fought to uplift." The words were deliberate. Betrayed, fought, uplift. But the country had heard something else. They had heard avoidance, not accountability, not apology. The statement didn't address Jasmine by name. It didn't mention the hearing. It didn't deny involvement in Scientology's inner circles. It didn't confront a single piece of evidence. Instead, it framed him as the victim of politics, of public opinion, of a world that had somehow turned on its hero. That same night, the top comment on his post read, "If truth feels like betrayal, maybe it was never truth you were protecting." It was shared 60,000 times. But what rattled his camp more than the hashtags or the trending charts were the headlines from outside the entertainment sphere. The Atlantic ran a feature titled, "Celebrity Isn't Innocence: Why Tom Cruise's Legacy is Now a Public Reckoning." The Washington Post ran a lead editorial, "The Price of Silence Paid in Fame." And in The Guardian, a former Scientology member published a full exposé detailing a decade of internal control practices, naming Cruise not as an actor, but as an active benefactor in the church's highest privilege circles. For the first time in his career, Tom Cruise wasn't playing a role. He was being written into someone else's story. And Jasmine? She didn't respond to his statement, not publicly, not immediately. She returned to work. She held constituent meetings. She reviewed committee notes. But she knew they were watching her now, waiting for her next sentence, her next pause, her next choice, and she would make it carefully, because this wasn't about going viral anymore. This was about what happens when power tries to declare itself the wounded party after a lifetime of building walls to keep itself above consequence. And Jasmine Crockett had never feared walls. She'd been sent to break them. And just when it seemed the air in the chamber could not carry one more ounce of consequence, Jasmine Crockett rose. The rustle of suits, the shifting of committee folders, even the dimming camera lights, all stilled like prey sensing a predator in the room. No theatrics, no shouting. She didn't adjust her microphone or clear her throat. She simply stood there, framed by the harsh congressional lights above, and the weight of every eye now fastened to her like a vice. This wasn't the beginning of a closing remark. This was the detonation. Her voice was low but blade sharp, like it had been honed on betrayal. "You want final words?" she said, scanning the room. Not for approval, but for witnesses. "Then hear this." She leaned forward ever so slightly, palms resting against the mahogany desk that had seen decades of confessions, compromises, and cover-ups. "If light," she paused, letting the silence draw in like a breath about to be broken. "If light is only used to cast longer shadows for the powerful, then maybe it's not light we need more of." Several heads tilted, brows furrowed. She didn't flinch. "Maybe what we need is a little more darkness, so we can finally see the truth." It was not a flourish. It was a verdict. And it hit the room like a hammer swung through stained glass. A second passed, then two, and the silence wasn't still. It was electric, buzzing with the pressure of a truth too raw to be politely digested. Across the table, one senior representative, gray hair, veteran of a dozen oversight committees, removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and set them down as if even glass could no longer shield him from the clarity Jasmine had unleashed. Chairman DeLuca tried to respond, but his throat caught the moment like gravel in a clutch. "Congresswoman Crockett," he finally managed, "that will be entered as your final statement in today's record." No one clapped, because this wasn't Hollywood. This was a war fought in suits and paper, and Jasmine had just dropped a bomb that no one was prepared to disarm. And then, the vote. You could feel it before the first "I" was called. The tension, the institutional reluctance battling with moral inevitability. They weren't just voting on Scientology. They were voting on whether they had the spine to confront power that wore a charming smile and global box office numbers. Representative Callahan from Utah hesitated a moment too long before casting his "I." You could see the flicker in his eyes. Career or conscience? He chose conscience. Barely. One by one, the votes came in. "Aye. Aye. Nay. Aye. Aye." Then a pause. 17th vote. "Aye." Chairman DeLuca closed the roll, exhaled slowly, and announced the result. By a vote of 17-3, the committee hereby authorizes the formal investigation into the Church of Scientology and its affiliated financial and psychological operations. The words didn't echo. They landed. A moment later, the gavel struck wood. Not as punctuation, but as a seismic shift. Outside the chamber, the world didn't wait. Cable news cut away from weather updates mid-sentence. Push notifications hit phones like a digital thunderclap. Congress launches official probe into Scientology. Crockett's final statement goes viral. "We need more darkness to see the truth." On the Capitol steps, reporters swarmed, elbowing for space, flooding live streams with frantic updates. But Jasmine, she didn't stop for cameras. She didn't hold a press conference. She walked past the microphones with the calm of someone who understood that some fights weren't meant to be framed in 30-second sound bites. Her message had already been delivered, and it had detonated exactly where it needed to, in the spine of a government that had, for too long, pretended some powers were too soft to be dangerous. The vote was over, but the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was the kind of silence that comes just before the earthquake hits. When the news broke that Tom Cruise had suspended all public appearances and terminated his involvement in every upcoming film project, it didn't come through a tearful press conference or some late-night talk show apology. It came through a brief, calculated statement from his longtime publicist. 47 cold words posted to social media. No questions taken. No follow-up. Mr. Cruise will be stepping back from public life for the foreseeable future. He thanks his fans for their support. That was it. The man whose face had been on more movie posters than most actors could dream of was gone in an instant. Studio executives scrambled. Franchises crumbled. Hundreds of millions of dollars were vaporized in days. But what haunted the public wasn't the silence. It was the realization that no one truly knew who Cruise had been serving all these years. Not Hollywood, not the audience, but something far more concealed, something far more powerful. And now, thanks to one woman's unrelenting questions, the curtain had finally been pulled back. Inside the Capitol, a different kind of shockwave had just been set in motion. Following the explosive hearings, the House Oversight Committee moved swiftly. The Cultural and Religious Influence Transparency Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. 17-3. It was more than a bill. It was a declaration. No more shadow alliances between ideological organizations and public figures. No more unchecked influence on vulnerable minds cloaked in celebrity charisma. The law mandated full financial transparency for any public figure with ties to religious or quasi-religious institutions. It gave legal recourse to victims of ideological coercion, and for the first time in U.S. history, it established an investigative body specifically to audit and regulate the lobbying practices of belief-based organizations. The message was clear. Belief could be free, but not bought. Faith could be personal, but never weaponized for power. It was a legislative thunderclap that rewrote the rules, and the woman behind it was just getting started. Outside the chamber, the world was watching. News outlets ran continuous coverage of Jasmine Crockett's final words at the hearing, words that had turned viral, quoted like gospel. If light is only used to cast shadows behind power, then maybe we need the dark to see the truth. That line echoed across every platform, in every language. It wasn't just a soundbite, it was a reckoning. Time magazine moved fast. Within days, the editorial board unanimously voted to feature her as the woman who reshaped American belief. The cover showed Jasmine standing alone beneath the storm-darkened Capitol dome, her hands folded calmly, the crucifix on her necklace gleaming against her black suit. The expression on her face was not triumph, it was resolve. Not the resolve of someone who had just won, but of someone who knew the battle was only just beginning. Inside the feature, a bold subtitle read, "Not all revolutions require blood, some just require clarity." What followed next could not have been scripted, though Hollywood tried. In a move that stunned the entertainment world, The Church of Power, a Netflix-backed documentary, premiered less than 2 months after the hearings ended. Narrated by a former Scientologist turned whistleblower, the film chronicled decades of hidden manipulation, psychological conditioning, and financial coercion tied to the organization's most powerful celebrity members. Halfway through the film, the screen cuts to a congressional clip, Jasmine Crockett staring down Tom Cruise across the hearing room. The moment freezes. The narrator's voice cuts in. Power used to look like a throne. Now it looks like a smile on a movie screen. The impact was electric. The documentary became the most-watched nonfiction premiere in streaming history within 48 hours. The public didn't just watch, they reacted. Protests erupted outside Scientology centers in Los Angeles, Clearwater, and even London. Anonymous testimonials flooded online forums, and somewhere in a quiet mansion tucked in the Hollywood Hills, a man who once jumped on couches now sat alone, surrounded by silence too loud to bear. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was never about Tom Cruise. It was about the idea that influence, when left unchecked, becomes control. And that control, when wrapped in charisma, becomes invisible. She had faced down a living symbol of that truth, and she had survived. More than survived, she had shifted the axis. People once too afraid to speak now found their voices. People once dismissed as conspiracy theorists were now being listened to. Jasmine hadn't just questioned a man, she had questioned a system, and won. But even she understood the cost. In interviews following the hearings, she admitted she no longer walked freely without security. She admitted her emails were constantly monitored, her phone tapped more than once. When you shine a light into a place where money and belief hold hands, she told CNN, you don't just get heat, you get fire. Yet still, she pressed forward. In one of the final scenes of The Church of Power, viewers see raw footage never aired on television. It's Jasmine, standing outside the Capitol building after the hearings, flanked by reporters. A young woman breaks through the crowd holding a sign that reads, "I left because you stood." Jasmine doesn't cry. She just nods, says thank you, walks on. For those who'd been watching, for those who'd grown up idolizing faces on movie screens only to question their own beliefs in adulthood, Jasmine Crockett had become more than a name. She had become a fulcrum, a point upon which history had pivoted. She did not scream. She did not grandstand. But she did something more dangerous. She told the truth, and she made it impossible to ignore. So when the final credits rolled on the documentary and millions sat stunned in their living rooms, there was only one question left echoing through America's mind. If the stories we tell shape the world we live in, who gets to choose which ones we believe? As the credits rolled on the Church of Power and the final frame faded to black, a silent silhouette of Jasmine walking alone past the Capitol at dawn, a deeper question began to rise, not just from the screen, but from the silence it left behind. What does it mean when truth finally speaks louder than myth? In a country built on ideals yet often shaken by contradictions, Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with one of the most powerful symbols of modern celebrity wasn't merely a political collision. It was a mirror held up to a nation addicted to charisma, lulled by influence, too often blinded by the glare of icons while ignoring the quiet decay beneath. But Jasmine didn't come to this fight with a thirst for attention. She came armed with something far rarer, the courage to name power, not just possess it. For decades, Tom Cruise had embodied a kind of American invincibility, the untouchable, ever-grinning embodiment of success, discipline, and curated perfection. And Scientology, shielded by money and mystery, had thrived in the gaps of accountability, selling salvation like a subscription and silencing dissent with fear masked as faith. When Jasmine stood up, she wasn't just standing against a man. She was standing against the idea that fame was above scrutiny. That belief, if branded well enough, could be sold without question. That influence, if televised, was the same as truth. And that's where the lesson lives. It lives in her refusal to be dazzled, in her refusal to lower her voice just because others had raised theirs first. It lives in her unwillingness to let inspiration become a license for manipulation. Because inspiration without accountability is just performance. And performance, when weaponized, is not harmless. It's structural violence, dressed in applause. The deeper human lesson isn't that Jasmine won, it's that she chose not to be small in a room that was designed to shrink her. When the cameras turned to Cruise, he glowed. When they turned to Jasmine, she burned. Not with rage, but with resolve. She didn't ask the public to choose sides between a movie star and a politician. She asked them to choose between comfort and conscience. And America, one finally, chose conscience. But conscience always comes with a price. Jasmine had no entourage, no PR firm, no legal team rehearsing her sound bites. What she had were stories, those of mothers, children, whistleblowers, and doubters who'd lived under the suffocating grip of belief systems engineered to control. She carried their weight on her back and brought it into a room built for spectacle, not truth. She didn't lecture, she listened first. And when she spoke, it wasn't scripted, it was lived. This story is not about religion versus government. It's not even about Tom Cruise versus Jasmine Crockett. It's about a quieter war, the war between illusion and integrity, the war between what we're sold and what we know. And every nation fights it in one form or another. In this version, America finally saw that being inspired isn't enough when the source of that inspiration is built on secrecy, intimidation, and unchecked power. In the days following the hearing, millions rewatched the confrontation, not for the drama, but for the clarity. For once, a public official did not retreat into vague diplomacy. Jasmine didn't say no comment. She said, "This is manipulation." She didn't hide behind legalese. She pointed and named, exposed and endured. She withstood smear campaigns, threats, even isolation from her own colleagues. And she never flinched. There's a moment in every seismic shift, a line where history bends. For many, that moment came not in Jasmine's final words, but in the pause just before. That breath, where she looked around the room, saw every eye on her, and didn't blink. In that moment, power shifted, not because she demanded it, but because she no longer feared it. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside a sealed congressional forum in Washington, D.C., Chelsea Clinton, daughter of a president, clashes with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a black woman forged by courtroom injustice, over one searing issue: should emotion ever shape national policy? Chelsea tries to discredit Jasmine's passion as noise, using composure and pedigree to stay above the fire. But within 6 minutes, Jasmine drops 3 real stories, one signed confession, and a single sentence that freezes the room. When truth speaks louder than legacy and silence becomes a weapon, what does it cost a nation to finally listen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights inside the Ronald Reagan Presidential Center didn't just shine, they interrogated. Each spotlight turned the stage into a battlefield, exposing every gesture, every glance. It was the opening night of Democracy Solidarity Week, a live, uncut, nationally broadcast forum. 700 invited guests packed the room. Senators, activists, veterans, Gen Z firebrands, all silent, all waiting. Across the country, millions watched, not for policy, but for a moment. A slip, a spark, or maybe an uprising. Then she stepped in. Chelsea Clinton, former first daughter, global health advocate, board member of the Clinton Foundation, emerged first, flanked by the sheen of legacy and generations of curated applause. She walked with the ease of someone who had always been heard, who had always been introduced before she even spoke. Her eyes scanned the room like she owned it. When they landed on Jasmine Crockett, she paused, not out of recognition, but calculation. Her gaze moved on like a CEO skimming a spreadsheet. Crockett, by contrast, didn't move. She sat tall, no smile, no twitch of performance. Her stare was stone, not cold, but carved from something older, harder, forged in rooms where no cameras had ever dared enter. And then the moderator's voice cut through the hush like a scalpel. "Tonight we ask one question," he said, his voice steady but wired with tension. "What defines the next generation of leadership in America? Inherited influence or earned experience?" The words echoed as if the walls themselves had been waiting for someone to say it aloud. Crockett didn't blink. Clinton crossed one leg over the other, smoothing her skirt like a queen awaiting tribute. The crowd was silent, not out of respect, but anticipation. Something in the air was alive and electric, because everyone knew, in the next 90 minutes, someone's version of power was going to break. The question still hung in the air when Chelsea leaned forward, a smirk barely hidden beneath the carefully practiced calm of someone used to speaking without being challenged. She wasn't answering. She was setting the tone, her tone. She straightened her papers, cleared her throat like a professor about to correct a student, and let her voice glide across the room, soft but sharpened, with something unmistakable. "I have to say," she began, "I truly admire your energy, Congresswoman Crockett." She drew out the pause, long enough for the room to feel it, short enough to still sound civilized. "But don't you ever wonder if constant outrage loses its power?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was a precision in her tone, the kind that didn't stab, it sliced, like a velvet glove concealing a scalpel. Outrage. She said it like a flaw, a self-indulgent tick, a habit one might pick up in poor company. It wasn't a question. It was a provocation dressed in manners. She glanced toward the audience, her eyes scanning for affirmation, the way one might scan a dinner party for polite laughter after delivering a witty jab. A few obliging chuckles came from the back rows, nervous, half-hearted. But that was enough. Chelsea eased back in her chair with the confidence of someone who believed she had just taught a lesson. Her posture said, "I've done this before, and I know what I'm doing." She smiled, only with her mouth. Her eyes never softened. They stayed sharp, calculating, as if Jasmine's entire presence on that stage was a performance she had already categorized, already filed away under "too emotional to last." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the mic, didn't shuffle in her seat, didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head, slowly, intentionally, as if she'd heard this script 100 times before and had already memorized every false note. Her stare didn't meet Chelsea's. It went through her. Not confrontational, not theatrical, just unflinching. Like someone who had been looked at wrong her whole life and had learned not to look away first. She didn't speak, but in the way she didn't react, the room felt something shift. The air tightened. The audience leaned forward, not to cheer, not to clap, but because something honest was about to happen. And deep down, everyone could feel it. Chelsea had spoken from a podium. Jasmine was sitting inside a memory. There was no need to correct Chelsea's tone. Jasmine had lived through what that tone tried to erase. And just when it seemed like the silence might stretch forever, Jasmine breathed in, slow and steady, then spoke not to counter Chelsea's words, but to unearth what those words refused to see. She looked straight at Chelsea, her voice calm and steady, stripped of anything extra. "Is this really about how I'm speaking?" she asked slowly, each word sharp and clear. "Or is this your way of saying I shouldn't be allowed to speak like this at all?" She paused, not to perform, but because the weight of her words needed space. "You hear me raise my voice and think it's unprofessional. I raise my voice because it once saved my life." The room froze. No clapping, no coughing, just a waiting stillness, like everyone had forgotten to breathe. Jasmine didn't stop. "There was a little girl I met a couple years ago. Her name was Ania. She was 9, loved puzzles and spelling bees. Super smart. One day, a boy at her school grabbed her wrist. Hard. She told a teacher. No one did anything. The next time he did it, she pulled away and yelled. And that's when the school suspended her for being disruptive. No one asked why she yelled. No one asked what happened to her. This time, Jasmine held Chelsea's gaze like she wasn't just telling a story. She was handing her a truth that couldn't be ignored. "You want to know what the principal said to Ania's mom?" Her voice dropped. He said, "Some of these kids just don't know how to handle their emotions." A low murmur ran through the room. "These kids." Jasmine let those words sit there, heavy and loud in their quietness. He wasn't talking about a little girl. He was talking about a problem, a warning sign, a disruption. And that's how a 9-year-old black girl with bruises on her wrist got sent home to think about her behavior, while no one thought to protect her. Chelsea glanced at her watch. It was small, polite, but it spoke louder than words. "This is boring. This is too much. I've heard it all before." Then came the sigh, quiet, controlled, like she wanted the audience to know. She wasn't impressed. Jasmine saw it. Everyone saw it, but she didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She just spoke lower, slower, heavier. "Last year I met a teen in Chicago. His name was Darius, 16 years old, smart, a quiet kid, straight A student, always respectful. He wore a hoodie and had a deep voice. One day in history class, he raised his hand to ask why the teacher skipped over the Tulsa massacre. He didn't yell. He didn't interrupt. He just asked. The teacher told him to wait in the hallway." Jasmine's jaw tightened slightly, but her tone stayed calm. Later, the school counselor flagged him for aggressive energy, said he might need to be watched. Darius had never been in trouble. He volunteered every week at the library, but they put a warning on his file. Why? Because his voice was too deep, because his stare was too steady, because his clothes looked like someone else's fear. She placed her hand on the table, firm, steady, like claiming ground. "I speak clearly and you call it attitude. Darius asks a question and they say he's dangerous. What exactly is the line we're supposed to walk to make other people feel safe?" Then she leaned in slightly, not to attack, but to make it impossible to look away. "Has anyone ever asked why our voices have to sound smaller than our pain?" The moderator didn't move. The cameraman, trained to stay stone still, barely remembered to breathe. Chelsea tilted her head, gave a half smile, just a twitch. The kind of smile people give when they think, "Really? We're still talking about this?" Jasmine caught it. She knew that smile. "No," she said, sharper now, not loud, just clear, and aimed right at the truth. "I know that look. I've seen it too many times. That's the look people give when they think grief is being exaggerated. But let me tell you, We don't fake this. We live with it. We carry it. We teach our kids how to survive it. She didn't blink, didn't waver. You want to talk about tone? She said, her voice tight, cutting through the air. Where was tone when Ania's mom had to teach her daughter that speaking up could get her punished? Where was tone when Darius started whispering in class so people wouldn't call him aggressive? Now she turned away from Chelsea, facing the whole room. Where was tone when I walked into a courtroom and the bailiff asked if I was the defendant? Because it didn't even cross his mind that I might be the lawyer? Now the audience reacted. Gasps. Real ones. But Jasmine didn't stop to soak it in. She wasn't here to win approval. This isn't about how we speak. It's about whether we're allowed to take up space at all. Because some people still think certain voices should know their place, should be quiet, should wait their turn. And then she turned back to Chelsea one last time. You think this is drama, she said evenly. I think people are losing their lives because too many others are too polite to feel uncomfortable. She didn't shout it. She didn't dress it up. It hit like a hammer in a silent room. And in that moment, under 1,000 watts of stage light, in front of 700 guests and millions watching from home, Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond. She shattered the idea that silence was ever neutral. The room hadn't fully recovered from Jasmine's last words when Chelsea moved again. Subtle, but deliberate. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, crossed her legs, and let out a soft, composed breath as if to reset the stage on her own terms. Her voice when it came was low and smooth, measured like marble. No one, she said, chooses the circumstances they're born into. She paused, giving the audience space to agree with her, to re-anchor themselves in something neutral. But adulthood means rising above them. Adulthood, she continued, means not letting emotion write our laws. The line was calculated, gentle on the surface but embedded with dismissal, like someone tapping the brakes during someone else's emergency. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The implication was clear. What Jasmine had delivered wasn't testimony, it was a tantrum, and in the calm stillness of Chelsea's tone, there was an insult sharper than volume. That logic lives in one voice, and emotion lives in another, and only one gets to govern. Jasmine didn't react, not with her body, but the silence she held in response was suddenly louder than any applause. Then she leaned in, just slightly, and spoke with the stillness of someone carrying too many stories to yell. You say you don't use emotion, she said, her voice stripped of performance, but that's because your voice was never taken from you. The air tightened. The words landed not like an argument, but like a fact someone had been too polite to say aloud until now. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't breathe in drama. She spoke like someone pulling truth from memory, not theory. You've never sat in a courtroom, she continued, where a 12-year-old was called hostile because he asked why his mother couldn't afford an attorney. You've never stood in a school hallway where a teacher uses the word aggressive because a student raised her hand too fast. Her tone was steady, controlled like a blade meant not to harm, but to carve open pretense. You don't use emotion? She asked, her eyes locked on Chelsea's now, unflinching. You've never needed to. The system was built to hear you even when you whisper. Now the audience wasn't just silent, they were frozen. You talk about maturity like it's the absence of feeling, Jasmine said. But for some of us, feeling is the first thing we were punished for, and the last thing we still have to fight for. Chelsea shifted, barely, but the motion was visible. A slight tightening of her mouth, a stillness in her shoulders. It wasn't that she hadn't expected a response. It was that she hadn't expected that one. Jasmine let the pause stretch, not for drama, but for space. The kind of space that had never been given to voices like hers without being clawed back. When I speak about these things, it's not to dramatize, she said, softer now, but just as firm. It's because I remember a mother in my district who was told her son was too expressive during a routine traffic stop. He ended up cuffed before she even finished a sentence. Another breath, deeper this time, but Jasmine held the tempo. You hear my voice and think it's too much, she said, but that's because you've never had to use it to stay visible, to stay alive in a system that writes you out the second you fall quiet. The stage didn't creak, but it felt like it might, because something had shifted. not just in the air, but in the power. Chelsea had tried to frame the moment as a question of professionalism. Jasmine had reframed it as a question of survival. And no one in the room, not even Chelsea, could pretend not to understand the difference anymore. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Jasmine simply shifted her weight forward, anchored her elbows on the table, and let the room feel the stillness before the storm. "There's a boy named Marcus Bell," she began, steady and exact. 14 years old. He loved building things. Legos, engines, anything he could take apart and put back together better. His teachers called him shy, polite, the kind of kid who apologized for things he didn't do. There was no flourish in her tone, just truth. One afternoon, he was walking home from school when two officers stopped him near a convenience store. Something had gone wrong earlier. A window smashed, a cash drawer missing. Marcus didn't run. He didn't argue. He answered every question, and still, they took him in. Jasmine paused, her eyes scanning the rows of silent suits and uncomfortable faces. They put him in a small room. No lawyer, no parent, just a desk, a chair, and a paper covered in legal language he couldn't begin to understand. He thought it was a permission slip, something to say, "I talked to the police and now I can go." So he signed it. A few gasps echoed from the back. Jasmine's voice dropped lower. What he signed was a confession. The paper said he admitted guilt to a felony-level offense. But Marcus didn't know what the word violation meant. No one explained it. No one read it to him. They just handed him a pen. The breath in the room thinned. 3 weeks later, he was assigned a public defender who didn't have time to visit him. His school removed him from the robotics team. The local paper printed his name. And just like that, a boy who had never even gotten detention was branded for life. Jasmine's gaze never left the center of the room. "You talk about policy without emotion," she said, her voice hardening. "But let me ask you this. What kind of policy makes it legal to trick a 14-year-old into signing away his future just to make a report look clean?" From the corner of her eye, she saw Chelsea stir, an almost involuntary movement, a tightening of her jaw, a wrinkle forming on her brow. She looked poised to interrupt, to rebut, to reframe, but no one passed her the mic, because for once, no one wanted to hear the counterpoint. They wanted to hear what happened next. Absolutely. Below is the rewritten version of the scene you requested, richer in depth, emotionally sharper, visually clearer, but still fully grounded in the original structure and message. It remains entirely focused, cinematic, and visceral, without spilling into the next beat of the story. The weight of her words hadn't even settled when Jasmine inhaled, just once, slow and clean, and said the kind of sentence that didn't just silence a room. It rewired it. "We speak louder," she said, not yelling, not pleading, just stating, because the mic only starts working after someone's bled. The entire audience froze. It wasn't shock, it was recognition. That sentence didn't float like rhetoric. It thudded like a verdict. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked as someone shifted forward, not to object, but to listen harder. The kind of silence that surrounds a confession or a reckoning. Chelsea, once perched in calculated elegance, began to fold, not dramatically, but visibly. Her body language didn't scream defeat, but it whispered retreat. Her spine curled inward, like her own posture wanted to disappear from the moment. Her hand tightened on her notepad, not to write, but to grip something solid. Her gaze no longer scanned the crowd for validation. It dropped to the edge of her lap like an anchor. The control she wore like perfume all evening, measured smiles, timed sighs, flickered and fell. In the third row, a retired police chief, silver badge still pinned on his lapel out of habit or memory, reached for his glasses. He didn't cry. He didn't frown. But he took the cloth from his coat pocket, and he cleaned them anyway. Once, then again. The way men sometimes do when the story no longer matches the rules they were raised on. Jasmine didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her focus stayed forward, body still, voice even. Because she wasn't trying to win the room. She was letting the room reckon with itself. "You want to talk about tone," her silence had said seconds earlier. Let's talk about the cost of being quiet. And without raising her voice, without moving from her chair, Jasmine Crockett had done something no stage direction could cue. She had turned every spotlight into a mirror. The echo of Jasmine's last sentence was still rippling through the room, alive in the silence, thick in the air, when Chelsea shifted forward in her chair. Her lips parted slightly as if she were preparing to retake control of the room with a well-timed rebuttal, a polished line about pragmatism, about the need for balance over passion. Her index finger tapped once on the edge of the microphone, ready to lean in. But before a syllable could escape, the moderator held up one palm, no sound, no smile, just a firm gesture of restraint. The meaning was unmistakable. Let her speak. Chelsea hesitated. That tiny pause, the first she hadn't chosen, clutched the atmosphere tighter. She leaned back slowly, not in surrender, in calculation. But it was already too late. Her rhythm had cracked. The moment wasn't hers anymore. Jasmine didn't rush. She let the stillness linger for a second longer until it wrapped around her words like flint around fire. Then, with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed none of this, because she had lived all of it, she said, "Some people grow up in the Oval Office. Some grow up in the interrogation room." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It just landed, cold and clean, like truth tends to do when it's not asking for permission. And the room detonated in silence. Not a word, not a breath. Just the slow internal combustion of 700 minds realizing what had just been laid bare. The sentence hit like a siren in a tunnel, short, impossible to ignore, and echoing off every surface. Chelsea's mouth stayed open for a half-second too long, her intended interjection frozen in her throat. She closed it slowly, a shallow gulp marking the moment her throat tightened. The corner of her lip, where that faint, bemused smirk had lived just minutes ago, flattened into a thin, neutral line. Her eyes blinked once, then again. And finally, for the first time that evening, she looked unsure of where to look. The phrase had sliced clean through legacy, through pedigree, through every polished line on her prep sheet. Jasmine hadn't said it with malice. She hadn't said it to shock. She had said it like someone reciting a street address she never got to forget. Across the room, a young woman, mid-20s, suit jacket too big for her shoulders, eyes locked on Jasmine, clutched her notebook a little tighter. Not because she needed to remember the quote, because something in her body told her she already would. For a long time. Jasmine let the silence expand again, not to savor the moment, but to give it weight, to let the contrast sit. She could have gone on. She didn't, because some truths don't need follow-up. They just need space. And in that space, something unspoken shifted in the room. Not allegiance, not applause, respect. The kind that couldn't be argued down. The kind that didn't belong to whoever had the next mic. It belonged to whoever just told the truth, without blinking. The air hadn't moved. Not really. And yet it felt heavier now, charged with something unseen but undeniable. You could sense it in the way people sat up straighter, in the way even the cameras seemed to pull in tighter, instinctively zooming toward the stillest figure in the room, Chelsea. Not because she commanded it, but because the balance had tipped. Jasmine's words, Oval Office versus interrogation room, still clung to the walls like smoke after an explosion. And when Chelsea finally spoke, her voice didn't carry the confidence it once did. I've never looked at it that way, she said quietly, almost to herself. It wasn't a concession, not yet, but it wasn't deflection either. It was the voice of someone realizing the floor beneath their argument might not be as solid as they thought. Her tone cracked at the edges, not from emotion, but from unfamiliarity. She was stepping into terrain she hadn't studied for. No footnotes, no prepared counterpoints, just the echo of a truth she couldn't refute. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't nod or soften. She didn't extend a branch of comfort or gratitude or polite forgiveness. She let the pause stretch like a taut wire, tension humming through the silence. Then her voice, low, controlled, and unshakably precise, cut clean through it. "Then don't lecture me about tone," she said. her eyes never leaving Chelsea's. Not when you've never lived inside forced silence. The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They pressed down. Every syllable landed with surgical weight, not shouted but anchored, spoken like someone who had been forced too many times to bite her tongue while the world around her spoke freely. It wasn't just about Chelsea anymore. It was about everyone who had ever called volume a problem, but never asked what made the voice grow loud in the first place. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her hands rested flat on the table, as steady as her breath. Her voice didn't break. That was the point. She had broken enough times in rooms where nobody noticed, and she had no interest in granting this room a breakdown to consume. Across the audience, a dozen expressions shifted. Not dramatically, not in unison, but enough to register the shift. A black woman near the back wiped at her cheek with her sleeve, not drawing attention, just grounding herself. A college-aged man near the front, head once cocked skeptically, now stared like a man watching a puzzle complete itself all at once. Chelsea blinked hard. Her jaw worked slightly, as if forming a sentence she knew would sound hollow. Her fingers tightened around her pen. That once effortless posture, casual superiority wrapped in polish, was gone now. She looked for the first time like someone who wasn't sure if the ground rules of the conversation still belonged to her. But Jasmine hadn't come for sympathy. She had come for air, real air, and truth had been her oxygen. I didn't grow up learning how to debate with polished smiles, she continued. I grew up learning how to read a room before I spoke, how to measure my voice so I wouldn't get labeled angry before I even opened my mouth. No one moved. You want to know what shapes tone? She asked, the rhetorical sharp as steel. Try sitting in a waiting room while your mother negotiates with a public defender who calls you him 3 times before realizing you're her daughter. Try being told to speak softer so you seem safer, even when you're the one in danger. Her eyes never left Chelsea, but her words widened, spoke past her, toward the room itself, to every nodding head, to every held breath. Tone isn't something we choose. It's something we carry. You call it performance. I call it survival. Chelsea exhaled through her nose. A long, deliberate breath. Not angry, not indifferent. Something closer to shaken. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not because she wanted to dominate, but because this was the first time the door had been forced open wide enough to speak plainly. You've never had to choose between being heard and being safe, she said. You've never walked into a job interview and seen the glance at your braids before the handshake. You've never had your passion recategorized as instability just because you dared to speak up after being ignored. The words stacked like bricks, one on top of the other, building something unignorable, something weight-bearing. No metaphor, no filter. I'm not angry at your privilege, she said. I'm angry that your comfort depends on my silence. That stopped everything. Even the cameraman shifted, subtly. Even the moderator, for all their neutrality, bowed their head just slightly. You don't hear how quiet it's been for us, because the silence has never been aimed at you, Jasmine added, her voice softer now, but no less exact. Her breathing remained measured, but her heart was working overtime behind the restraint. She wasn't just speaking, she was excavating, digging out decades of being told to moderate, to be reasonable, to temper the truth so the room wouldn't flinch. Well, the room had flinched, and now it had no choice but to stay still and listen. Don't talk to me about adulthood, she continued, her gaze direct and unwavering. Not when the world decided I was an adult the second I said no too loudly, or the moment I wore the wrong expression near a badge, or when I walked home alone and a man in uniform slowed down his car just to ask a question. The tension in the room didn't dissolve. It deepened. The kind of silence that no longer needed volume to feel loud. Chelsea opened her mouth, then closed it. The pen in her hand now looked less like a tool and more like an anchor, one she wasn't sure how to drop anymore. Jasmine leaned back finally, but her presence didn't retreat. It lingered in the air like a storm refusing to pass. You say adults shouldn't use emotion to shape policy, she said, almost contemplative. But maybe that's because emotions never shaped yours. Maybe the system already fits you so neatly, you never had to feel your way through its cracks. She let that sit. A long breath. Then, we don't use emotion to build our arguments. We use it to prove we exist. Then finally Jasmine's gaze shifted, away from Chelsea, toward the moderator, toward the room. She didn't ask for validation. She didn't need applause. She had already won something far more lasting, silence that wasn't indifferent. It was listening, and that was everything. The room hadn't moved, but the world had. And before anyone could exhale or gather their scattered thoughts, the moment had already begun to ripple through phones, screens, whispers, and headlines. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak. She detonated the lie that silence was ever neutral. And the echo of her words was already on the march. Within 20 minutes, clips of the confrontation were being clipped, captioned, and shared faster than algorithms could react. The moment where Chelsea Clinton lowered her eyes and Jasmine looked directly into the storm without blinking, froze in frame, overlaid with the quote now igniting social feeds like a fuse. "Don't lecture me about tone when you've never lived inside forced silence." It was quoted, paraphrased, rewritten, but the meaning never changed. The Guardian's homepage read, "Crockett shuts down Chelsea Clinton with the truth and the internet listens." The New York Times, often hesitant with headlines, offered no ambiguity this time. Jasmine Crockett's words stunned nation, a lesson in power, pain, and presence. But it wasn't just the mainstream. Civil rights pages, teacher forums, veteran blogs, and even conservative platforms couldn't ignore it. One commentator, an unlikely voice on a right-leaning podcast, whispered, "I don't agree with her politics, but that woman made me shut up and think." It was a reluctant respect, but it was real. The kind that says something has cracked through the armor. Churches projected her words on Sunday morning behind pulpits, once too polite to say race. In one black church in Birmingham, a young deacon read the quote about microphones only working after blood is spilled before his sermon, and grown men nodded through tears. Teachers printed the transcript for discussion. A middle school debate coach in Detroit canceled his lesson plan to let his students analyze Jasmine's line. "We don't perform grief, we carry it." One student, 12 years old, wrote on the board, "This is how my mom talks when the police are behind her." No one erased it. On a quiet campus quad in North Carolina, a group of first-year law students gathered around a laptop, replaying Jasmine's testimony frame by frame. One of them whispered, "This wasn't just a hearing, it was history," and she rewrote it in real time. They didn't need a textbook. They had a moment, and it was breathing. The headlines multiplied. "When justice sounds like fire, Crockett's words go global." Chelsea Clinton left speechless after Crockett's verbal masterclass. "Some people grow up in the Oval Office, some in interrogation rooms." That sentence just cracked America open. The speech became more than political. It became personal. It wasn't policy that Jasmine had offered. It was memory forged in friction. She'd spoken the quiet part out loud, on camera, under lights, with full awareness that power was in the room, and she didn't flinch. In suburban book clubs, mothers sat in silence after reading her words, wondering how many times they told their own kids to use the right tone without asking why their tone changed to begin with. In one library in St. Louis, a young woman left a Post-it note on the community board next to a copy of The Fire Next Time. It read, "Jasmine Crockett just lit a match. Don't look away." Even the silence of those who disagreed was telling. Conservative news anchors, eager to pivot, found themselves rerunning the clip, not because they supported it, but because it was unignorable. One panelist tried to minimize it, mumbling, "Well, she's emotional." But even that word rang hollow now. The audience didn't laugh. They'd heard what she said, and something about it stayed. It stayed because it wasn't just a story of being interrupted. It was the story of being born into interruption. And in that telling, Jasmine had cracked something deeper. The lie that neutrality is noble. The lie that tone can be separated from trauma. The lie that pain should only be persuasive if it's polite. On TikTok, a clip of Jasmine's calm stare, the one that cut through Chelsea like glass through water, was remixed with Nina Simone's "Ain't Got No, I Got Life." It went viral in hours. College girls mimed her words. Mothers stitched stories of their own moments of erasure. Veterans, Men who hadn't cried since Desert Storm commented, "That's the kind of leadership we need." Some tried to spin it as a gotcha moment, but it wasn't. Jasmine hadn't won in the traditional sense. She hadn't dunked. She hadn't grandstanded. What she did was more dangerous. She named what others refused to see. She called the quiet by its name, and now the nation was listening. In high schools across Texas, debate coaches printed her transcript alongside Martin Luther King and Baldwin. One teacher asked, "What makes Jasmine's argument so effective?" A student in the back, quiet until now, raised her hand and said, "Because it wasn't an argument. It was a memory that hurt too much to lie about." Even late-night hosts, usually cynical, paused the punchlines. One looked into the camera and said, "No joke here. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak truth to power, she made power feel truth for once." By day 3, major newspapers followed up. Interviews with educators, activists, and mental health workers filled segments. NPR ran a special, "The Politics of Presence," when a black woman refuses to whisper. And through it all, Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't post a victory lap. She didn't retweet the praise. Because it wasn't about her, it was about all the times she hadn't been allowed to speak. And now that the world had listened, it wasn't applause she needed. It was change. The noise faded, but the weight remained. Days after the media storm, the nation buzzed with interpretations, debates, and reenactments of a moment that refused to be diluted. But away from the screens, the applause, and the glare of public validation, something quieter, something far more human, was taking shape. It wasn't on a stage. There were no podiums, no cameras, no microphones clipped to lapels. Just a closed classroom in D.C., white walls and scuffed tile floors, filled with 24 Gen Z students from different states, backgrounds, and lives. The air buzzed with nerves, not from fame, but from history walking through the door. Jasmine Crockett arrived first. No entourage, just a black notebook in one hand and a dry erase marker in the other. She scanned the room with practiced calm, offered a slight nod to the students, then walked slowly toward the whiteboard, like she wasn't about to speak. But listen. The door opened behind her. Chelsea Clinton stepped in, quieter than the students expected. She didn't wear political polish today. No suit jacket, no press team, just denim, flats, and the look of someone who had come to understand that not every moment needed a podium to feel monumental. For a breathless moment, no one moved. No moderator introduced them. No one clapped. The room was already too full of silence charged with history. This was not a rematch. This wasn't theater. This was reconciliation, on terms set by those who had inherited the cost. Jasmine turned to the board and uncapped the marker. Her handwriting was sharp, deliberate, like every letter was a wound stitched with intent. "Don't speak louder, speak truer." She underlined it once. Then she stepped back. No speech, no preamble, just silence thick enough to demand reflection. Chelsea stood still for a moment longer. Then she walked forward and stood beside Jasmine. Not across from her, not opposite, beside. She looked at the words on the board. Her gaze lingered there, not like someone analyzing a quote, but like someone letting it hit where it needed to. Then without a word, she reached for the marker. She didn't edit, didn't erase. She signed underneath. So did Jasmine. No speeches, no cameras, no selfies. They handed the marker to the first student in the circle and stepped back. And that's when something changed. Because this wasn't about headlines now. It was about inheritance. What we pass on, what we undo, what we learn too late. One student, no older than 19, stood and spoke. "I watched that whole hearing 3 times, she said, voice tight, "and I realized no one's ever told me it was okay to be angry and intelligent. I thought I had to pick." Another student, a young man from Atlanta with sharp eyes and a hesitant tone, raised his hand next. "My brother was arrested for resisting when he didn't move fast enough during a stop," he said. "He was quiet, still got cuffed. I didn't know what to do. But then I saw you, Congresswoman, and I realized maybe my voice is allowed to be something." Chelsea listened, every word. No interruptions. her hands folded in her lap like someone attending a vigil, not a panel. She didn't speak until the fourth or fifth student had finished, and even then, it wasn't defense. It wasn't apology. It was something closer to confession. I grew up thinking empathy was enough, she said, slowly. But empathy without exposure can become assumption, and assumptions don't just mislead, they erase. The room didn't clap. It wasn't that kind of space. But they heard her. Jasmine nodded slightly, once. Not forgiveness, not approval, recognition of a truth finally spoken without armor. Another student stood, her arms crossed, not with defiance, but with a kind of practiced self-protection. My grandma never raised her voice, and she said, not because she didn't want to, because she didn't think it would matter. But I think if she heard that hearing, she would have stood. She looked at Jasmine directly. Thank you for standing. Loud. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her silence held gratitude and gravity all at once. Then a student near the back, barely audible, asked the question no one else had dared. Was it hard? He asked. Saying all that to someone like her? The room froze. Chelsea blinked slowly, and Jasmine, steady as stone, answered. It wasn't hard, she said. It was heavy. There's a difference. I didn't say it to win. I said it so the next girl with too much truth in her throat wouldn't be told to lower her voice just to survive the day. The boy nodded. His lips didn't move, but his eyes did. Another truth passed like a current through the room, and with that, Jasmine closed her notebook. Chelsea gathered her things. No signature, no soundbite, just a moment marked in ink on a whiteboard, and something deeper etched in each student's mind. Not a debate, not a detente, a reckoning, and a handing over of the mic. The two women left together, but this time, they didn't walk in front of the students. They walked behind. They didn't speak as they left the room. No cameras followed, no commemorative plaque was unveiled. But behind them, 24 students sat still, their eyes fixed on the words left on the board. Unpolished, unfiltered, unforgotten. Don't speak louder, speak truer. It echoed. Not because it rhymed, not because it sounded like something tweetable, but because for the first time in that room, maybe the first time in their lives, truth didn't arrive dressed in polish. It arrived dressed in pain, and the room didn't turn away. A few minutes later, the door clicked shut behind them, and silence took hold. Not the uncomfortable kind, not the fearful kind, the kind that comes when something has ended, but its echo has only just begun. Somewhere on some intern's schedule sheet, this session would be logged as private roundtable, youth policy engagement. But that's not what it was. It was an untelevised confrontation between two histories. One backed by privilege, the other by survival. And in the middle of it all stood the kind of honesty that can't be scripted. Later that night, in a quiet office lined with news clippings and old photographs, a journalist reviewed her notes for a retrospective column. She paused, then typed a single line at the top of the page, just above the headline space, not for print, just for her. One carried a name, one carried memory, but the one who made the room think twice walked in with the truth. The words landed heavy in her chest, not because they were clever, but because they were undeniable. Chelsea Clinton had inherited a lineage, one soaked in power, wrapped in policy, and shielded by legacy. Her surname could unlock rooms. It could buffer mistakes. It gave her the benefit of being presumed composed, even when she stumbled. Jasmine Crockett carried something else. Not a brand, a burden, not a name etched in marble, but names engraved on tombstones. She didn't walk into that room with talking points. She walked in with scars. Not visible ones, but the kind you carry in your voice when you've been silenced too many times to count. The kind that make your tone sharper, your breath steadier, your presence unavoidable. That's why the room had shifted, not because she raised her voice, but because she refused to lower her truth. And the room felt it, not immediately, not in applause, but in the way the students didn't check their phones, in the way the silence after each sentence wasn't empty, but full. Full of things they had never said out loud, full of stories they'd never known they were allowed to tell. Jasmine hadn't come to be admired, or celebrated, or even thanked. She came to shatter the illusion that the only voices worth hearing are the ones that don't shake. And that's what she did. Chelsea, to her credit, didn't try to retake the spotlight. She didn't interrupt. She didn't pivot. She didn't sanitize. She listened. For real. Maybe for the first time. And in that listening, raw, unscripted, exposed, something changed. Not everything, not enough, but something. The shift wasn't seismic, it was cellular. A single fiber in the fabric of generational misunderstanding had been pulled loose, not to unravel, but to be rewoven. Outside the building, the night moved on without fanfare. No paparazzi, no protests, no dramatic applause. Just two women walking toward their separate cars beneath the same unremarkable sky. But inside, in that closed room that would never make the news, the temperature had changed forever. In the days that followed, students began quoting Jasmine in quiet posts and anonymous essays. Churches played snippets of her testimony beneath gospel chords. College dorms turned her phrases into conversation starters. And somewhere in the Midwest, a social studies teacher erased a lesson plan and replaced it with, "Today we're going to talk about the sound of truth." Not the tone, the sound. It didn't matter whether they agreed with her politics. It didn't matter whether they even knew her name the week before. They remembered how she made them feel, like something true had just been said out loud, and no one could pretend otherwise. There are moments that change policies, others that shift public opinion, and then there are moments that change people. Jasmine Crockett didn't win a debate that day. She cracked something open. And in doing so, she proved a truth no panel could refute. That legacy might open doors, but only lived experience knows what the floor feels like. That names carry power, but memories carry weight. And when those two collide in the same room, only truth survives the silence that follows. One carried a name, one carried memory. But the one who made the room think again walked in with truth. And as the story faded from front-page headlines into the long memory of public conscience, something deeper remained, unseen but undeniable. Because what Jasmine left behind wasn't a speech. It wasn't even a victory. It was a wound made visible, a fracture in the polished floor of polite conversation that could no longer be ignored. That's where the real lesson lived. It wasn't in the silence she broke. It was in the silence she revealed. The one that had existed long before that room. In classrooms where Black children learned to lower their voices to survive. In courtrooms where justice was translated through accents. In job interviews where names on a resume decided a person's worth before a single word was spoken. It was the silence that crept in when a mother chose a soft tone over a sharp truth, afraid her honesty might make her child unhireable, unpromotable, uninvited. Jasmine didn't bring a new problem to the surface. She brought old pain to light, pain that had been packaged in professionalism, buried under data, whitewashed into issues. And she forced the room to confront it, not with rage, but with clarity, not with accusation, but with exposure. Her power wasn't in how loud she spoke. It was in how unmistakably human she made injustice feel. This wasn't about Chelsea Clinton. It never was. It was about the people who grew up thinking justice sounded like calm voices and polished grammar, while never wondering why the calmest voices in the room were the ones who'd never been silenced. It was about the ones who call for civility when confronted with raw memory, the ones who say tone matters, but have never had their stories twisted by the tone of someone else's comfort. Because the truth is, power fears emotion when that emotion is earned. What Jasmine taught, without a lecture, without a closing statement, is that some voices rise not because they want to dominate, but because they were never given space to simply exist. That sometimes clarity doesn't come dressed in neutrality. It comes wearing a scar, and those scars speak. The lesson then is not to speak softer. It is to listen harder. Not to flinch when someone tells you what it costs them to stand in that room. Not to shrink when pain refuses to be dressed up. Not to mistake raw honesty for hostility or quiet survival for passivity. But to recognize that dignity doesn't always whisper, it sometimes demands. The human truth Jasmine carved into that room, into every eye that watched, into every heart that stayed silent, because it was easier, was this. The world does not become more just by asking the wounded to whisper. It becomes just when the comfortable learn to hear the volume of pain without demanding it be polite. And that is not a theory. It is not a metaphor. It is a 9-year-old girl suspended for screaming when her wrist was bruised. It is a 16-year-old boy flagged for raising his hand in class. It is a 14-year-old who signed a confession because no one told him what violation meant. It is a congresswoman who walked into a courtroom and was assumed to be the defendant. It is the everyday burden of translating your very presence into something acceptable when your presence was never the problem. This is the lesson. That lived experience is not a liability, it's the evidence. That memory is not noise, it's the witness. And that if justice cannot bear to hear the truth when it is spoken with feeling, then maybe it isn't justice at all, just a quieter version of control. In the days after that hearing, the story didn't just echo in newsrooms. It echoed in churches, in lecture halls, in dorm rooms and dining tables, and whispered conversations between parents and children who finally had the language to ask, "Have you ever felt that way too?" And maybe that's where the healing starts. Not in a headline, but in a question, not in applause, but in understanding. Because what Jasmine did, what she refused to not do, was demand that people stop asking her to make her truth smaller just so they could keep pretending it wasn't real. And in doing so, she reminded us all, some people walk into a room with a last name. Others walk in carrying generations of silence. But the ones who leave that room forever changed are the ones who learn that truth doesn't need permission to be loud. It just needs space to be heard. And when that space is finally made, when the air is thick with memory and no one dares to interrupt, and silence no longer protects the powerful but reveals their indifference, something sacred happens. Justice begins to breathe. Not perfectly, not easily, but fully. And that, in the end, is what Jasmine Crockett left behind. Not a takedown, not a viral moment, but a new frequency. One that doesn't ask, "Can you say that more gently?" but instead demands, "Why did we need it gentler in the first place?" That is the lesson. That is the reckoning. And that is the beginning of change. But truth by itself is never enough, because the world doesn't change when someone hears the truth. It changes only when enough people refuse to let it be forgotten. And in the hours after Jasmine's words stopped echoing through that panel room, after the audience stood in stunned silence and the cameras slowly shut off, there was a decision to be made. Not by her, by us. What do we do when someone hands us their truth? Not as a gift, but as a burden we helped build. You could feel it, the shift, not in Washington, not in the headlines, but in the quiet, necessary places where power has always hoped no one would look. In the schools that write up little black girls for attitude while ignoring bruises on their arms. In the courtrooms where kids sign plea deals, they don't understand because no one ever explained that violation is not the same thing as guilt. In the police precincts where a raised eyebrow from the wrong teenager becomes a behavioral report. These aren't moments, they're patterns. And patterns, when left unchecked, become policies. That's what Jasmine exposed. Not just pain, not just bias. She exposed the scaffolding, the silent machinery that runs beneath every institution, pretending to be neutral. And now we're here, standing at the edge of the aftershock. So this is the part where you don't get to go back to comfort. You don't get to say powerful speech and move on with your day. You don't get to bookmark the video and tell yourself awareness is action. You don't get to quote her line about speaking louder without asking yourself why the microphone was off in the first place. You don't get to praise her conviction unless you're willing to carry even a fraction of the consequences that conviction brings. Because Jasmine didn't raise her voice for applause. She raised it because that's what happens when the volume of injustice outweighs the silence of policy. If you're asking, what can I do? Start with this. Understand that silence is not safety. It is strategy, and it never works in your favor unless you're the one the system was built to protect. Start by listening, not to what makes you feel good, to what makes you answerable. Then ask harder questions. Who are the Marcus Bells in your city, your school district, your courtroom? How many of them signed away their futures before they could legally rent a movie just because no one thought they needed to understand the language of the law? How many Aeneas were labeled difficult before anyone thought to ask them what happened? And how many Dariuses lowered their voices until they forgot what it felt like to speak freely? You don't need a title to make change. You need a threshold, a point where you decide that inaction costs more than courage. That moment is now. Volunteer at schools where suspension is the default. Join court monitoring groups where judges assume restless means guilty. Show up at school board meetings and ask why dress codes punish distracting hair, but not discriminatory comments. Fund legal aid clinics. Support trauma-informed education. Fight for restorative justice programs that treat pain like something to heal, not punish. And if you're in a position of privilege, if your skin, your salary, your zip code have given you the benefit of the doubt more times than you can count, then your job isn't just to listen, your job is to leverage. Leverage that access, that comfort, that safety. Make the phone call someone else would be arrested for making. Demand transparency someone else would be punished for requesting. Use the mic someone else would be denied. Be clear, this is not charity, it's restitution. Because Jasmine didn't ask for pity, she didn't ask for permission, she asked for accountability. And accountability, real accountability, is not poetic. It's procedural. It's written into budget lines. It's enforced by votes. It's sustained through exhaustion. And yes, it's often met with resistance. People will call it divisive. They'll call it dramatic. They'll say not everything is about race. They'll accuse you of being ungrateful, of being angry, of being unreasonable. But when the system is built to mute some voices, volume becomes a form of survival. And if that makes people uncomfortable, good. Let them sit in that discomfort, because comfort never dismantled a single unjust policy. Let them flinch. Let them shift in their seats. Let them lower their eyes, because that's what Jasmine had to endure just to be heard. 1,000 little dismissals dressed as decorum, 1,000 smirks disguised as debate, but she still showed up, still sat in that seat, still told the truth, knowing full well that the room wasn't built to receive it. That's courage. But it's not her burden alone anymore. Now it's yours. So don't wait for the next Jasmine to walk into the room and bear the weight of silence again. Be the one who breaks it. Be the one who stops asking for better tone and starts demanding better laws. We are not at the end of the story. We are standing in the part where it can finally turn. But only if enough people do more than clap. Only if enough people get louder than the lie. Because truth is only dangerous when it threatens the system that relies on forgetting. And Jasmine Crockett just made forgetting impossible. So don't you dare look away now. But even now, even after all the lights have dimmed and the headlines have faded from the front page, there's one more thing left to say. Change doesn't begin in the moment someone speaks. It begins in what people choose to do when no one is watching. And if Jasmine Crockett taught us anything, it's this. Silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the consequence of convenience. It's what happens when people with the power to act decide that comfort is more valuable than justice. But she showed us the opposite. That discomfort can be a form of truth-telling. That awkwardness, tension, conflict, these aren't the enemy. They're the evidence that something honest is finally happening. What Jasmine did in that room wasn't just about confronting Chelsea Clinton. It was about confronting a system that teaches people to fear the sound of a voice that doesn't flatter them. A voice that doesn't wait for permission. A voice that carries not just opinion, but memory, history, survival. She didn't ask to be understood. She asked to be witnessed. And now that we've witnessed it, the next question is, what will we do with that witness? Because you don't get to unsee it. You don't get to forget the way Chelsea's voice cracked when she realized she wasn't debating a theory. She was standing in the path of someone's lived reality. You don't get to forget the way Jasmine's tone didn't rise. It deepened. The way it didn't perform, it cut. And you definitely don't get to forget the way a single sentence, you don't get to teach me about tone when you've never lived through forced silence, wasn't just a comeback. It was a reclaiming. It was an act of survival, weaponized into clarity. That kind of clarity doesn't disappear when the room clears out. It lingers. It follows you home. It sits with you when you scroll past another report about a teenager suspended for talking back, when all he did was ask a question. It echoes when you hear someone say, well, maybe she should have been more polite, and realize they've confused dignity with obedience. It reminds you that somewhere, right now, a child is being taught not how to think, but how to shrink. And unless we step into that pattern and interrupt it, we become part of it. So the call isn't just to act, it's to remain accountable after the applause stops. It's to show up for school board elections that no one thinks are sexy. It's to read policy when it's boring, because policy is where injustice hides. It's to talk to your kids, your coworkers, your pastors, your principals, not about tone, but about trauma, equity, presence, power, and the long echoes of history that still shape every hallway a child walks down. You want to honor Jasmine's moment? Then build something that outlives it, not a mural, not a quote on a poster, but a shift in how we see who belongs in rooms, in how we listen when someone's voice makes us uncomfortable, in how we stop demanding that pain be expressed quietly in order to be heard legitimately. Because what Jasmine Crockett proved isn't just that truth can be weaponized, it's that truth can be architectural. It can build pressure, it can reshape rooms, it can crack glass that was never meant to break. And when that happens, when the cracks finally start to show in systems that once felt untouchable, you don't get to ask for repairs. You get to ask for redesign. So redesign with us, rewrite the questions, rethink what it means to speak professionally, reclaim the spaces that taught you silence was safer. Because if we've learned anything from the story that just unfolded, it's that justice doesn't wear a suit. Sometimes it walks in wearing pain like armor. Sometimes it doesn't raise its voice because it's angry. It raises its voice because it has no other way to survive. And when that voice finally breaks through, the most dangerous thing we can do is treat it like a moment, because it was never a moment. It was a beginning. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.